The sky over the Arizona Territory didn't just weep, it bled. A bruised, violent purple bled into streaks of angry orange as the storm gathered its breath over the Dragoon Mountains. For Adelaide May Collins, a woman who owned little more than a patch of stubborn dirt and the calluses on her hands, the storm was just another bully in a long line of them. But this storm was different. It wouldn't just steal topsoil or rattle the windows of her lonely cabin. It would deliver a dying man to her doorstep, an Apache hunter riddled with lead. A man her world had taught her to fear, to hate. And in healing him, she would unknowingly ignite a feud that would burn hotter than the desert sun, and force a choice that would cost her everything she had, or grant her, the one thing she'd never known, a life truly lived. The wind was a living thing. It clawed at the sod roof of Adelaide's small cabin, a one-room testament to futility, dug halfway into a lonely hillside. It shrieked through the cracks in the warped plank door and taunted the small, sputtering flame of her tallow candle. Outside, the rain came not in drops, but in sheets, turning her parched cornfield into a churning sea of mud. Adelaide May Collins was no stranger to hardship. At 26, she wore the grief of a widow and the bone-deep weariness of a farmer wrestling with cursed land. Her husband, a good man named Thomas, with more hope than sense, had been taken by a rattler 2 years prior, leaving her with his dream and his debts. The dream was this small homestead, 160 acres of rock and dust, that the devil himself would likely pass over. The debts belonged to Bartholomew Riggs, the squat, powerful rancher, whose land surrounded hers like a tightening noose. Every month, the shadow of his foreman fell across her door, a reminder that she was one failed crop, one sick mule, away from losing it all. Tonight, the loneliness was a physical weight. The storm amplified the cabin's emptiness, making the silence between thunderclaps deafening. She clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders, her knuckles white. It was in one of those lulls, a moment of held breath in the heart of the tempest, that she heard it. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the groan of a straining cottonwood. It was a sound scraped raw from a human throat, a guttural exhalation of pure agony, almost stolen by the wind. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Her first thought was of Riggs's men, perhaps drunk and looking for trouble. Her second, more primal fear was of the people who haunted the edges of every settler's mind, the Chiricahua Apache. The newspapers in Purgatory Creek, the nearest collection of saloons and sinners, called them ghosts' savages. Stories of raids and bloodshed were traded over whiskey like currency. Her hand went to the old shotgun Thomas had left her, resting on pegs above the hearth. It was heavy familiar. She crept to the door, peering through a crack in the wood. The world outside was a maelstrom of rain and churning darkness, lit in strobing hellish flashes by the lightning. Another flash illuminated a shape near the rickety fence of her goat pen. It was a man sprawled face down in the mud, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. He was dark-skinned, his black hair plastered to his skull, clad in little more than hide leggings and a breechcloth. An Apache. Adelaide's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct, every whispered warning she'd ever heard screamed at her to bar the door, douse the light, and pray he was gone by morning. To help him would be madness. To be found with him would be a death sentence, one way or another. Riggs would use it as the excuse he needed to run her off. The townsfolk would call her a traitor. Or worse, his own people might come looking for him and find her instead. She watched her breath fogging the wood. He tried to move a pathetic, desperate crawl that gained him inches before he collapsed again. A low moan, a sound of utter defeat reached her over the wind. It wasn't the sound of a demon or a ghost. It was the sound of a man dying. Damn it all. She whispered the words a curse and a prayer. She couldn't. She simply couldn't leave a man to die in the mud, not even an enemy. The lessons of a childhood spent reading the good book, taught by a mother whose kindness was her only inheritance, warred with the harsh realities of the territory. For a long, agonizing moment, the war raged within her. Then, with a sigh that seemed to drain the last of her strength, her mother won. Grabbing a thick blanket and the shotgun, she unbarred the door and plunged into the screaming storm. The rain was a physical blow, cold and blinding. The mud sucked at her worn boots, trying to drag her down. Reaching the man, she knelt. He was unconscious, his body frighteningly cold despite the fever she could feel radiating from his skin. Rolling him over was a struggle. His face was lean with high cheekbones and a strong jaw etched with pain even in his stupor. A dark, ugly stain spread across his side and back, the rain-thinned blood, a grim watercolor on his skin. 2 bullet wounds, one high on the shoulder, the other, the worse one, low in his side. They were crude, ugly holes, torn by lead fired from close range. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Half dragging, half carrying, she hauled him back toward the flickering yellow light of her cabin. The effort was immense, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning. The mud was a greedy beast and the wind a constant shoving hand. Finally, she tumbled through the doorway with her burden collapsing onto the packed earth floor, gasping for air, drenched and shivering. She slammed the door shut, barring it against the storm and the world, and looked down at the bleeding, unconscious Apache hunter at her feet. The devil was in her house, and the deluge, she suspected, had only just begun. The hours that followed bled into a nightmarish blur of water blood and muttered prayers. Adelaide worked with a frantic, desperate focus, pushing aside her fear and exhaustion. She stripped the man of his wet leggings and breechcloth her movements, clinical, her eyes avoiding anything but the wounds. Her patient modesty, a virtue in another life, was a luxury she couldn't afford. The mud and blood washed away to reveal a body lean and corded with muscle, crisscrossed with the pale silvery lines of old scars. This was a man whose life was a story written in violence. The bullet in his shoulder had passed clean through a ragged tunnel of flesh. The one in his side, however, was still lodged deep. Probing for it was out of the question. She had neither the tools nor the skill. All she could do was stop the bleeding and fight the fever that was already taking hold. She tore strips from one of her only 2 good linen sheets, her jaw tight at the sacrifice. She boiled water over the fire, adding handfuls of yarrow she'd gathered, and dried a trick an old Mexican woman had taught her for stemming bleeds. She cleaned the wounds as best she could, her touch surprisingly gentle. The man flinched and groaned, his body arching in silent agony, but he never regained consciousness. As she worked, the storm outside began to recede, its fury replaced by a steady, mournful drumming on the roof. Inside, a new storm was brewing. The man's fever climbed his skin, becoming a furnace. He began to thrash his head, tossing back and forth on the thin pallet she'd made for him near the hearth. And he began to speak. The words were in a language she didn't understand, a torrent of guttural, sharp-edged sounds that tumbled from his lips. They were the whispers of a ghost, the echoes of the life that was trying to flee his body. Though she couldn't grasp the meaning, the tone was unmistakable. There was anger, betrayal, and a deep, soul-crushing sorrow. He was reliving the moment he was shot. He'd cry out, his hands clenching into fists. His eyes, though closed, would flicker wildly beneath the lids. Names were repeated. One in particular was a harsh bark, Daklugi. It was spoken like a curse, spat from his lips with venom. Another sound was softer, almost a plea, a name that sounded to her ears like Ishkene. Adelaide sat on a low stool, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth, a prisoner to his delirium. The cabin, her sanctuary, was filled with the phantoms of his life. Through the fragmented fever dreams, she began to piece together a story, a council, a disagreement, a plan for a raid he seemed to be arguing against. The name Daklugie was always linked with gestures of aggression, of pointing toward the east, toward the lands of the white settlers. Her patient, it seemed, was arguing for peace, or at least caution. She saw it in the way his hands would form signs of fist brought down on an open palm, a sign of disagreement. Then he would turn his back, exposed, and his whole body would jolt as if struck by lightning. A cry of betrayal, of shock. He hadn't been shot in a fair fight. He'd been shot in the back by his own people. The revelation settled in Adelaide's stomach like a cold stone. This wasn't a wounded warrior from a raid on a settlement like hers. This was an outcast, a man betrayed. It didn't make him any less dangerous in the eyes of the world, but in the quiet solitude of the cabin, it changed him. He was no longer just an Apache. He was a man named... Well, she didn't know his name, but she knew the sound of betrayal in any language. For 2 days and 2 nights, she was his anchor to the living world. She forced broth made from a scrawny rabbit and bitter herbs between his cracked lips. She changed his dressings, her stomach churning at the angry, inflamed look of the wound in his side. Infection was setting in a faint, sweet, rotten smell that was the perfume of death. She knew with a sinking heart that she was losing the fight. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Not in a gentle receding, but like a dam bursting. A violent sweat drenched him, soaking the pallet and the blanket. His breathing, which had been a ragged, shallow pant, deepened into a slow, rattling rhythm. His thrashing ceased. He fell into a stillness so profound that for a terrifying moment, Adelaide thought he had died. She crept closer, her heart in her throat, and laid a trembling hand on his chest. Beneath her palm, she felt it, a faint, steady beat. Slow but strong, a survivor's heartbeat. Exhaustion, absolute and overwhelming, crashed down on her. She slumped onto the stool, her head falling into her hands, and for the first time since the storm began, she wept. They were not tears of fear or pity, but of a strange, terrifying relief. She had tethered this ghost to the earth, but in doing so she had bound him to her. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of the man she had saved, and the deafening question of what on God's green earth she was going to do now. He woke as the sun was setting on the 4th day. Adelaide was by the hearth, stirring a thin stew of beans and corn, when a faint rustle from the corner made her freeze. She turned slowly. 2 dark, intelligent eyes were watching her. They were no longer clouded with fever, but were sharp, clear, and utterly unreadable. Fear, which had been a dull ache, sharpened into a blade. The man she had tended was a patient, a body. This man, awake and aware, was a stranger, an Apache warrior. In her home. He tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips as he clutched his side. He fell back, his jaw clenched. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in the sparse furniture, the shotgun over the hearth, and finally Adelaide herself. There was no gratitude in his gaze, only a guarded, wary assessment. He was a wolf in a trap, sizing up the trapper. Adelaide's hand edged toward a heavy iron skillet on the stove. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a dry whisper. "Easy now. You've been hurt bad." He obviously didn't understand her words, but he understood the universal language of caution. His gaze flickered to the skillet, and then back to her face. For a long moment, the only sound was the bubbling of the stew and the man's measured breathing. Slowly, deliberately, Adelaide took her hand away from the skillet. She ladled some of the stew into a bowl and approached him as one would a wild animal. She stopped a few feet away, knelt, and placed the bowl on the floor. Then she retreated back to the hearth, making it clear she was no threat. He watched her every move. After a moment, he reached with his good arm, his movements stiff with pain, and drew the bowl toward him. He ate not with the ravenous hunger of a starving man, but with a slow, methodical purpose. When he was finished, he pushed the bowl away and locked his eyes on hers again. This was how they existed for 2 more days, a silent, tense dance of survival. Adelaide would leave food and fresh water for him. She would tend to his wounds, her movements quick and efficient, avoiding his gaze. He would watch his silence, a heavy blanket over the small cabin. He was healing with a speed that astonished her. The color returned to his skin and the strength to his limbs. He began to sit up his back against the wall for longer and longer periods. On the 7th day since the storm, he stood. He was unsteady, using the wall for support, but he was on his own 2 feet. He walked the few paces to the cabin door, looking out at the sun-drenched landscape as if seeing it for the first time. He stood there for a long time, a silhouette against the bright light. Adelaide held her breath. This was it. He would leave. He would walk back into the wilderness he came from, and her life, for better or worse, would return to what it was. A part of her felt a profound sense of relief. Another, smaller part she refused to acknowledge felt a strange pang of something. Loss. He turned back from the door, his face grim. He walked with a slight limp to stand directly in front of her. He was taller than she'd realized, casting a long shadow that swallowed her whole. He looked down at his bandaged side, then at his shoulder. He touched the clean linen with his fingertips, his expression unreadable. Then he looked directly into her eyes. The intensity of his gaze was like a physical touch. He raised his right hand palm open and placed it over his heart. He spoke, and for the first time, his voice was not a fevered whisper, but a low, resonant baritone that filled the small room. "Ndabinda," he said the words, clear and deliberate. He paused, ensuring he had her full attention. "Shibigalni Alil." Adelaide stared, uncomprehending. I don't understand." He seemed to sense this. He lowered his hand from his heart, and then pointed to himself. Then he slowly knelt, not in supplication, but with a profound, solemn dignity, and touched his forehead to the toe of her worn leather boot. He stayed there for a heartbeat, then rose to his full height again. He pointed to himself. "Nache," he said, tapping his own chest. It was his name. Nache. Then he made a gesture, a simple, sweeping motion that encompassed the cabin, the land, her. Then he pointed back to himself again. He repeated the word slower this time. "Shai Bigal, Ni Alil, my life is yours." The meaning crashed down on Adelaide with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just thanks. This was a vow, an oath sworn in a language she didn't speak, but understood in the marrow of her bones. He believed she had saved him from death, and by the code of his people his life now belonged to her. Panic seized her. "No," she said, shaking her head, taking a step back. "No, you don't owe me anything. You were hurt. I couldn't leave you in the rain. You're free to go. You should go." Nache just watched her, his expression unchanging. He didn't understand her panicked words, but he understood her rejection. It didn't matter. The vow had been made. His face was set like stone. He was not leaving. Adelaide May Collins, the poor widow of Purgatory Creek, had wanted only to survive. But in a single act of compassion, she had done something far more dangerous. She had acquired a life that came with a past full of ghosts, a life that belonged to an Apache warrior named Nache. And she had the terrible sinking feeling that his life, now bound to hers, was going to cost her the last remnants of her own. The uneasy quiet of the cabin was replaced by a strange new reality. Nache did not leave. He also did not speak beyond the occasional quiet word in his own tongue that Adelaide couldn't understand. Instead, he acted. As his strength returned, he began to repay his debt in the only currency he possessed: skill and effort. He moved with a silent, unnerving efficiency. One morning, Adelaide woke to find the wobbly leg of her table had been fixed, braced, and bound with rawhide strips she didn't even know he had. The next day, the axe, which had a loose, splintering handle she'd been meaning to fix for months, was solid and firm, re-wedged and balanced to perfection. He saw a need, and he filled it without a word being exchanged. His presence was a constant, unnerving weight. He was a ghost in her home, but a ghost who could mend fences and track game. One afternoon, he disappeared into the hills behind the cabin with nothing but a knife she hadn't even seen him carry. He returned hours later at dusk, a brace of plump quail hanging from his hand. He laid them on her doorstep, a silent offering, and retreated to his corner. Adelaide was trapped between gratitude and terror. The quail meant precious meat, a welcome change from beans and cornmeal, but it also meant questions. How could she, a lone woman, suddenly be so proficient at hunting? The answer came 2 weeks later, when her supplies ran dangerously low. She had no choice but to hitch her stubborn mule Jezebel to the buckboard and make the half-day trip to Purgatory Creek. The thought of leaving Nache alone at the cabin was unsettling, but the thought of bringing him with her was impossible. Before she left, she tried to explain with gestures. She pointed to the empty flour sack to her stomach, and then to the east toward town. Nache watched her, his expression impassive. Then he gave a short, sharp nod. He understood. As she was about to climb onto the buckboard, he touched her arm. He held out a single, perfectly crafted arrow. It was fletched with hawk feathers, the obsidian arrowhead sharpened to a wicked point. He gestured for her to hide it under the seat. It was a weapon, a warning, a promise. Purgatory Creek was less a town and more a collection of weathered buildings clinging to life around a muddy, rutted main street. It consisted of a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. It was a place that thrived on gossip and suspicion. As Adelaide tied Jezebel to the hitching post outside Simmons's general store, she felt the familiar weight of eyes on her. She was an outsider, the widow Collins, who was too proud or too foolish to sell her useless land to Bath Riggs. Martha Simmons, the store's proprietor, was a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval. "Adelaide," she said, her voice thin. "Running low, are we? Just the usual, Martha. Flour, salt, some coffee if you have it." As Martha weighed out the flour, she leaned in conspiratorially. "Heard you had some trouble during that big storm a few weeks back. Jedediah Stone rode out your way. Said your fences looked a bit torn up." Adelaide's blood ran cold. Sheriff Stone, a lazy, corrupt man who was firmly in Bath Riggs's pocket. "The wind was strong," she said, keeping her voice even. "That's all." Martha pressed her beady eyes, searching Adelaide's face. "Bath Riggs was in here yesterday. Said he's worried about you all alone out there, with the Apache getting bolder. Said he'd be willing to make you another offer on that plot. For your own safety, you understand." "My safety is my own concern," Adelaide said, her voice sharper than she intended. And Mr. Riggs's offer is as insulting now as it was last year. She paid for her goods, her hands trembling slightly. As she was leaving, the batwing doors of the saloon swung open, and Bartholomew Riggs himself stepped out, blocking her path. He was a bull of a man with a florid face and small, greedy eyes. He was flanked by Sheriff Jedediah Stone, a man who looked more like a pig in a waistcoat, his tin star tarnished and crooked on his chest. Mrs. Collins. Riggs boomed a false smile, stretching his lips. Good to see you in town. I was just telling the sheriff here how concerned I am for your well-being. I'm managing Mr. Riggs, Adelaide said, trying to push past him. Riggs put a fleshy hand on her arm, stopping her. Are you funny, thing? One of my boys was riding the north fence line near your property. Found some tracks, moccasin prints, Chiricahua by the look of 'em. You haven't seen any stray visitors, have you? His eyes bored into hers, searching, accusing. Adelaide's heart felt like a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She thought of the arrow hidden under the seat of her buckboard. She thought of Natchez waiting back at the cabin. The only visitors I get are your foreman, Mr. Riggs telling me to get off my own land, she said, yanking her arm free. Now, if you'll excuse me. She practically ran to the buckboard, loading her supplies with frantic energy. She could feel Riggs's and Stone's eyes on her back the entire time. They were vultures, circling, sensing a weakness they couldn't yet identify. The ride home was filled with a new kind of dread. The secret she was keeping was no longer just a matter of her conscience. It was a lit fuse. Riggs and Stone were suspicious. They wouldn't just let it go. They would poke and pry until they found the truth, and when they did, they would use it to burn her world to the ground. When she finally saw the thin curl of smoke from her cabin's chimney, a wave of relief washed over her so potent it made her dizzy. Natchez was there. He was safe. But as she pulled the buckboard to a halt, she saw him standing outside the door, looking not at her, but past her toward the east, toward Purgatory Creek. His hand rested on the handle of his knife, and his face was a mask of cold, hard calculation. He had seen the way she'd fled town. He had seen the fear on her face. He knew the vultures were circling too, and he knew that they were circling not just for her, but for him. Life on the homestead fell into a new tense rhythm. The unspoken secret between Adelaide and Natchez became the foundation of their strange partnership. Communication was still a tapestry woven from gestures and intent. He taught her without words how to read the subtle signs of the desert, the bent twig that signaled a deer's path, the flight pattern of a hawk that meant a snake was near. In return, she taught him the English words for things pointing and speaking clearly: water, fire, bread. He would repeat them in his low voice, the foreign sounds awkward on his tongue at first, but his mind was sharp, and he learned quickly. A fragile trust began to grow in the space between them. She no longer reached for the skillet when he moved suddenly. He no longer watched her with the constant wary assessment of a cornered animal. One evening he found her struggling to reshoe the mule, the heavy tools clumsy in her hands. He took the hammer and rasp from her, and with a quiet confidence he shod Jezebel with a skill that rivaled any blacksmith. Adelaide watched, marveling at the strength and sureness of his hands. He was a hunter, a warrior, but he was also a man who understood the mechanics of the world. Yet as their internal world solidified, the external world pressed in. Natchez began to spend hours away from the cabin, not hunting, but scouting. He would return with grim reports delivered in a handful of English words and stark gestures. Men, horses, watch. He had seen Riggs's men riding the perimeter of her land, more frequently their rifles held ready. They weren't just checking fences. They were searching. The true danger, however, came not from the east, but from the west, from the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. It came from Natchez' own past. One afternoon, he returned to the cabin, pale and grim. He carried a single object, a broken arrow shaft. The fletching was crow feathers bound with dark sinew. Adelaide didn't understand its significance until he drew a symbol in the dirt, with a stick, the same symbol, painted on the shaft. It was a stylized coyote head. Daklugi Natchez said the name a venomous rasp. He then pointed to the symbol, and then to himself, and made a cutting motion across his own throat. My enemy. He then pointed to the hills. They come. The hunters had become the hunted. Daklugie and his warriors had not forgiven Natchez' perceived betrayal. To them, Natchez had not only argued against a necessary raid, but had then vanished. In their harsh world, such an act was tantamount to desertion, or worse, collusion with the White Eyes. They would have tracked him from the site of the shooting, their skills honed by generations of survival in this unforgiving land. They were close. The days that followed were thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to hold a man. Natchez became a different person. The quiet helper was gone, replaced by the vigilant warrior. He barely slept, spending the nights outside the cabin, a silent guardian melding into the darkness. He showed Adelaide how to load her shotgun faster, his hands guiding hers, his touch impersonal and focused. He forced her to practice shooting at targets until her shoulder ached and the smell of gunpowder was ingrained in her clothes. He began preparing the homestead for a siege. He moved rocks to create small defensible positions. He dug a shallow trench along the back of the cabin. He showed her the weak spots in the walls and how to brace them from the inside. He was preparing for a war he never wanted in a place he never chose. One evening, as a blood-red sun sank below the horizon, they saw it. On a distant mesa, silhouetted against the dying light, were 3 riders. They sat motionless on their horses, their forms stark and menacing. They were too far to see clearly, but their intent was as clear as a signal fire. They were watching, observing, planning. Adelaide felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. This was real. This wasn't just the whispers of Purgatory Creek or the greed of Bath Riggs. This was a death sentence delivered on horseback. She looked at Natchez. He stood beside her, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the distant figures. There was no fear on his face, only a grim, sorrowful resolve. He had brought this storm to her door. His past, full of shadows and blood, was about to consume her present. Why, Adelaide asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did they shoot you? Natchez was silent for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the mesa. His English was still broken, a collection of single words. But he had been listening, learning. He turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the last of the sun's fire. Daklugi. Want rifles, he said, his voice low. Raid for rifles. For fire, I say. No, I say, wait, the cost. Too much blood. Our blood. Your blood. He paused, searching for the right words. He called me weak, said I had a white man's heart. He touched his own chest. He is brother. To me? Was. The pieces clicked into place. It was a dispute over power, over the future of their people. Daklugi wanted war. Natchez had argued for caution, and for that his own brother had shot him in the back and left him for dead. And now they were here to finish the job. As darkness swallowed the landscape, the 3 figures on the mesa melted away. But they both knew they weren't gone. They were closer now, shadows moving through the chaparral knives, drawn waiting for the moon to rise. The siege was about to begin. Night fell, not as a blanket, but as a shroud. The familiar, comforting sounds of the desert, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote were absent, swallowed by a silence that felt heavy and predatory. Inside the cabin, the only light was the faint, ruddy glow from the banked embers in the hearth. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Adelaide sat on a low stool, the heavy shotgun resting across her lap. Her hands were slick with sweat, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every creak of the cabin's old wood, every rustle of wind through the scrub brush outside, sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. This was her home, her sanctuary, and it had become a trap. Nache moved with a liquid silence that was both terrifying and comforting. He was no longer the quiet patient or the helpful handyman. He was a creature of the night, an instrument of war. He had stripped to his breechcloth, his skin smeared with a mixture of mud and ash to break up his silhouette. In his hand, he held his knife. Tucked into his waistband was the hawk-feathered arrow she had hidden in the buckboard, now a deadly close-quarters weapon. He checked the braces on the door and the shutters. He moved to the small window, peering out into the oppressive darkness. "They wait," he whispered, his English sparse but clear. "Wait for moon." Adelaide nodded, unable to speak. She watched him, a man preparing to defend a life that was not his in a place that was not his home, against people who were his own. The terrible irony of it was a bitter taste in her mouth. The moon rose a pale, sickly crescent that cast long, distorted shadows across the land, and with the moonlight they came. There was no war cry, no thundering charge. The attack began with a soft thump against the cabin's west wall, followed by another. Adelaide flinched, but Nache held up a hand for silence. He crept to the wall, pressing his ear against the wood. "Fire," he breathed. Suddenly, a flicker of orange light appeared beneath the shuttered window. They were trying to set the dry timber of the cabin ablaze. Before Adelaide could even process the thought, Nache was in motion. He unbarred the door, flung it open just a crack, and was gone, melting into the darkness, so quickly he seemed to be an apparition. Adelaide's world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. She was alone. Her knuckles were white on the stock of the shotgun. Outside, a cry of surprise and pain was cut short. A heavy thud. Then silence again. The silence was worse than the noise. Her imagination filled it with horrors. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then the door creaked open, and Nache slipped back inside, as silent as he had left. There was a fresh, dark slash of blood on his cheek that was not his own. He held up one finger. One down. 2 to go. He moved to the rear of the cabin to a small opening they had prepared barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. It was a bolt hole, but it was also a listening post. He gestured for her to watch the front. The attackers were smarter now. They knew he was outside a predator in the dark. A new sound reached them, the frightened bleating of her goats. They were creating a diversion, trying to draw him out. Nache didn't move. He remained still, listening, his entire body a coiled spring of lethal patience. Then came a scraping sound from the roof. The sod roof, her greatest protection, was now her greatest vulnerability. One of the attackers was up there trying to find a way in, perhaps to drop fire down the chimney. "The roof," Adelaide whispered, her voice trembling. Nache nodded. He pointed to the hearth, then to her shotgun. The plan was terrifyingly simple. He would go out the back. He would be the bait. She was to wait until the attacker was at the chimney, and then... He gave her a look, a brief, intense connection in the dim light. It wasn't a look of reassurance. It was a look of grim necessity. A look that said, "Do not hesitate." He slipped out the back opening. Adelaide was alone again, her fear a suffocating presence. She moved to the hearth, her shotgun aimed at the dark square opening of the chimney above. She could hear him now, the Apache on her roof, scrabbling, moving slowly toward the chimney. A small clump of dirt fell onto the embers, hissing. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the gun steady. This was murder. To shoot a man, even one, trying to kill her. Thomas had taught her to shoot rabbits for the pot, not men. Outside, Nache made his move. A shout, a challenge in the Apache tongue, rang out from the side of the house. It was a deliberate ploy to draw the attention of the man on the roof. Adelaide heard the scraping above her. Shift heard a grunt of surprise. Now. It had to be now. She squeezed her eyes shut, aimed the double barrels of the shotgun up the chimney, and pulled both triggers. The roar inside the small cabin was apocalyptic. It was a physical blow of sound and force that threw her backward. Soot and smoke billowed out of the hearth, choking her. A terrible strangled cry came from above, followed by the heavy rolling thud of a body falling from the roof. She lay on the floor, deafened her ears, ringing, gasping in the acrid smoke. She had done it. She had killed a man. The thought brought not triumph, but a wave of nausea. The fight was not over. The third warrior, the leader, it had to be Daklugi, was still out there. A furious cry of rage erupted from the darkness, a name torn from a throat raw with hatred. Nache. A shot rang out, not the boom of her shotgun, but the sharp crack of a rifle. Adelaide scrambled to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. In the pale moonlight, she saw them. Two figures circling each other in a deadly dance in the clearing in front of the cabin, Nache and Daklugi. Nache held only his knife. Daklugi had a rifle, which he was now using as a club, swinging it viciously. He must have fired his one shot and missed. It was a brutal, primal fight. They crashed together, grunting with effort, the sound of their blows sickeningly loud in the night air. Daklugi was bigger, stronger, fueled by a raw fury. Nache was faster, more agile, weakened by his old wounds, but driven by a cold, desperate need to survive. Adelaide watched, helpless. This was Nache's battle, a reckoning born of betrayal, long before he had ever collapsed in her yard. She saw the flash of Daklugi's knife, saw Nache stumble back, a dark line appearing on his arm. He was tiring. Daklugi raised his rifle like a war club for a final killing blow. Without thinking, Adelaide burst out of the cabin, not with the shotgun, but with the one thing she had in her hands, the heavy iron skillet from the stove. She ran, screaming a wild, incoherent cry of rage and terror, and brought the skillet down with all her might on the back of Daklugi's head. There was a sickening crack. Daklugi froze his eyes wide with stunned disbelief. He turned his head, slowly looking at her, as if she were a ghost. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed in a heap. Silence. Absolute and complete. The battle was over. Adelaide stood, panting, the heavy skillet hanging from her numb fingers. Nache stared at her, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his arm. He looked at the bodies of his people, his brothers, and then at her, the white woman who had saved his life not once, but twice. His face was a canvas of shock grief and something else, something she couldn't name. The devil's anvil had been her own hearth, and on it, in blood and smoke and desperation, something new and terrifying and unbreakable had been forged between them. Dawn broke, painting the ravaged clearing in shades of grey and pink. The light did not bring relief, only a stark, ugly clarity. The bodies of the two warriors lay where they had fallen. Daklugi was stirring, groaning a testament to the thickness of his skull. The scene was one of brutal, desperate survival, a tableau of the violence that had been visited upon Adelaide's quiet life. Adelaide felt hollowed out, a stranger in her own skin. The woman who had wept over using her good linen for bandages was gone. In her place was a woman who had killed a man to protect another. She looked at her hands, half expecting them to be stained with blood, but they were just covered in soot. Nache was already moving. His grief was a palpable thing, a heavy silence that seemed to soak up all the sound around him. But he did not keen or cry. He acted. With grim purpose, he bound the unconscious Daklugia's hands and feet with rope from the barn. He then gently, almost reverently, carried the bodies of the other 2 warriors a short distance away and covered them with blankets from the cabin. It was a gesture of respect for the men who had come to kill him. He came back to Adelaide, his face etched with exhaustion and sorrow. His new wound was a deep gash on his forearm, which she cleaned and bound with the last of her linen strips. Their hands touched, and a current of shared trauma, of a bond, forged in the crucible of violence passed between them. "They will come," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The law." He gestured toward the east, the rancher. Riggs. He was right. The gunshots her shotgun blast, Daklugi's rifle shot, would have carried for miles in the still night air. Someone would have heard. Someone would come to investigate. And what they would find would be a lone woman, a live Apache, and 2 dead ones. There was no version of that story that ended well for her. Or for him. They had to erase the evidence. Working together in the growing light, they became a silent, efficient team. They dragged the bodies further into the hills to a shallow wash and covered them with rocks and brush, a hasty, unmarked grave for men who had been Nache's kin. They scuffed out the bloodstains in the dirt, scattered dust over the tracks, and tried to make the clearing look as undisturbed as possible. Daklugie. They dragged into the small barn out of sight, his fate an unanswered question hanging between them. They had just finished when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of shod horses approaching at a gallop. Inside, Nache commanded, pushing her toward the cabin. "Say nothing. You know nothing." He tried to retreat into the shadows of the barn, but it was too late. A posse of 5 riders burst into the clearing, led by Sheriff Jedediah Stone and a smug-looking Bartholomew Riggs. Colin Stone bellowed his horse, prancing nervously. His eyes, small and piggy, took in the scene, the splintered wood of the door, the scorch marks on the roof, and Adelaide standing there, looking pale and dishevelled. Then his eyes fell on Nache, who stood near the barn, motionless and defiant. Stone's hand immediately went to the pistol on his hip. Well, Riggs the sheriff drawled, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. "Looks like we found the source of your moccasin tracks. Seems Mrs. Collins has been keeping company with a redskin." "I told you she was trouble," Sheriff Riggs said, dismounting. He strode toward Adelaide, his face a mask of false concern. "We heard shooting. Adelaide, we came to make sure you were safe. And look what we find. You've been harboring this savage. After all the trouble they've caused, it's against the law." He was hurt. Adelaide said, her voice shaking but firm. "I helped him, that's all." "Helped him," Stone scoffed. "Looks like you helped him start a little war." "Where are the others?" His eyes scanned the clearing. We heard more than one shot. This was the moment. The lie had to hold. But before Adelaide could speak, Nache took a step forward. He held his hands up, palms out, a sign of peace. But his eyes were locked on Riggs's rifle, a brand new Winchester repeater hanging in the scabbard on his saddle. Nache spoke his English, slow, deliberate, each word, a carefully chosen stone. "2 men. Come. My people." He looked at Adelaide. "We fight. They run." It was a plausible lie. But Riggs wasn't buying it. He walked over to Nache, looking him up and down with contempt. You expect us to believe that two of your kind run from one lone brave and a woman." He laughed. "Sheriff, I think we should take them both in. Her for aiding a fugitive, and him for being what he is." This was it, the end of the line. Riggs would get her land. She would end up in a cell, and Nache would end up at the end of a rope. Then Nache did something unexpected. He looked past Riggs directly at Sheriff Stone. He pointed a finger at the rancher. "Ask him," Nache said, his voice gaining a hard, accusatory edge. "Ask him where he gets new rifles." Stone looked confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Ask him about Daklugi." Nache continued, his eyes burning with intensity. He looked from Riggs to his rifle and back again. "Daklugi. Want rifles for raid. Riggs. He sell. Sell to Daklugi. For war. So army comes. So land is empty." The accusation hung in the air, stunning everyone into silence. Adelaide stared at Riggs, and for the first time she saw a flicker of panic in the big man's eyes. It was a monstrous but brilliant accusation. Riggs instigating Apache raids by illegally selling them rifles, all to scare settlers off their land and drive the natives out, leaving him to pick up the pieces. It made a terrible kind of sense. "That's the most insane thing I've ever heard," Riggs blustered. "This savage is lying to save his own skin. Is he a new voice cut in?" From the barn, Daklugi stumbled out, pushed from behind by the barrel of Adelaide's shotgun. He was awake, bleeding from his head, but very much alive. He looked at Riggs, and his eyes were full of a murderous betrayal. Riggs had promised him rifles, but he had not promised that another Apache would be armed and waiting at the place he was supposed to attack. Daklugi spat on the ground at Riggs's feet. "Pinda Likoyi," he snarled. "White-eyed liar!" The posse men looked at each other, then at Stone, then at Riggs. The simple story of a homesteader and a savage had just become dangerously complicated. Sheriff Stone, for all his corruption, was not a fool. He knew a powder keg when he saw one. Gun running to the Apache was a federal crime, one that would bring the U.S. Marshals down on his little fiefdom, and he wanted no part of it. Stone cleared his throat. "Riggs, maybe you and me should have a talk back in town." The game had changed. Nache's life was no longer forfeit, not when he was a witness. Adelaide was no longer a criminal, but a victim. The debt was repaid. Nache hadn't just saved her from Daklugi. He had saved her from Riggs, from the law, from the loss of her home. He had given her life back to her. But as the posse led a protesting Riggs and a sullen Daklugi away, a new reality dawned. Adelaide looked at her cabin, at the blood-soaked ground, at the ghosts that would forever haunt this patch of dirt. It wasn't her home anymore. It was a battlefield, a grave. She looked at Nachai, who stood watching the riders disappear. He was a man without a tribe, an outcast from his own people, a target for the whites. She was a woman marked by scandal, forever tied to the savage she had saved. They were both ghosts belonging to no world. He turned to meet her gaze. His vow, "My life is yours," had meant something different in the beginning. It had been the pledge of a subordinate, a man in debt. Now it was a statement of fact. His life and hers were inextricably, dangerously intertwined. "We cannot stay," he said. And she knew he was right. Without another word, Adelaide walked into the cabin. She gathered a small bundle of things, some food, her mother's Bible, the deed to the land. She walked back out and laid the deed on the table. It was worthless to her now. Nache had her mule ready. He had his own small pack, materializing from some unknown hiding place. He offered her a hand up onto Jezebel's back. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice quiet. Nache looked to the north toward the vast, unknown territories, toward lands that were not yet scarred by greed and hatred. "We find a place," he said. He did not get on the mule with her, but began to walk his stride long and tireless, leading her away from the ruins of her old life. She did not look back. They were two outcasts, a man who had lost his past, and a woman who had lost her future, riding into an uncertain dawn with nothing left to hold on to but each other. His life was hers, and now hers was his. And so the story of Adelaide Collins and the Apache hunter Nache doesn't end with a sunset, but with a journey into the unknown. Their tale is a stark reminder that the Old West wasn't just a battle between cowboys and Indians, but a complex tapestry of personal wars, quiet acts of courage, and the surprising bonds forged in the most desperate of circumstances. It forces us to ask, what is the true nature of a debt? And what happens when an act of simple human decency sets your entire world on fire? Their path forward was uncertain, shadowed by the worlds they'd left behind. They were fugitives from everything they had ever known, seeking not a home, but a place where they could simply exist. What do you think happened to them on that long road north? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If their story of courage and survival moved, you please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and subscribing for more tales from the untamed heart of the West. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for listening.